What's up, guys? In my last video I talked about what I did as a pre-immersion beginner. So today I'm going to talk about what I did after immersion. So what was it like being a Korean immersion learning beginner? So I think this covers everything from about the first month of immersion all the way to about the third, fourth month, maybe up to the fifth month. But I think it's also helpful to first define what I think being a beginner was like and the transition to being an intermediate. So I think a beginner is like being blackout drunk, pissing in the dark, basically. So you don't know, because I have no direction. No direction. You don't even know where where you are. So it's the same for language learning. So in the beginning, I felt I was still stumbling around. So I wasn't sure if I was sticking to immersion. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. I was trying all sorts of different things. I didn't know. I didn't know what direction I should be headed in, and I didn't even know enough of the language to actually enjoy the content. So that's what I think a beginner is like. So, in contrast, an intermediate probably has enough experience to have a clear, definite direction, and they probably know enough of the language to actually start to enjoy native content. So I think that's the difference between a beginner and intermediate. So I wouldn't exactly put a number. So I wouldn't have a number of cards. I wouldn't have a number of immersion hours to define the line between beginner and intermediate. I think it's more about the mindset. And so I'm going to talk about what I did in the beginner phase. So I hope that beginners watching this video could probably get some information about what to do and what not to do as a immersion beginner. Because I talked about the mistakes I made as a beginner, but then I probably didn't talk a lot about my own personal things I did for immersion. So I'm not going to talk about it in a linear fashion. I'm going to talk about each element, and then I'm going to talk about how I progressed for each element. So starting with the SRS, because I think Retro didn't even have his deck back then. So this is a whole new world. It was a wild west of Korean immersion learning, right? So the only deck was the Evita deck. So I downloaded that from Anki, and then so I mined through that. I went through that. That was before Morphman 2, so I'll talk about that later. So I start with the Evita deck. I made cards from all the sentences I read from the Talk to Me in Korean grammar series, and then and then I had so those were my first two decks, and because I haven't I didn't really look into the Anki settings. I basically use the default Anki settings. So anyone who has worked with Anki before, they know that the default settings are just hell, right? And so I especially didn't have low-key Anki installed, so that was absolute hell. Then I learned more about the method, and so I found the Substitute SRS software, and so I started to download videos. So I remember my first deck. The first S2S deck was the ISO1 Star Road series on VLive, because that was the first video series I had that had Korean subs, right? So I downloaded that, and the way I mined it was brute force mining. So that's before the Rainus Morphman fork, right? So by brute force mining, I meant literally I would sit in front of a computer, my laptop, and just go through sentences like manually, right? So because I was a beginner, I had to suspend like 80% of the cards. That was just how bad it was. So, and because I was still in a very ACAD phase, just that brute force mining alone, I would do 50 cards, right? And so that would be, I'd say that took me about 1 to 2 hours a day. So I talked about this in my 8-month update. But yeah, I was in the beginning I was spending a lot of time, and then I was also mining sentences from the Yonsei readers, but I end up getting lazy with the highlighting, so I just stopped mining. I just used it as a pure reader. So I had my own Evita deck, my grammar deck, my SRS deck, and so that was before Morphman. And so, as you can tell, and also with very, very bad basic Anki settings, I was spending a shit ton of time on Anki. So that's literally 1 hour 45 minutes a day just on Anki alone. Um, and so but because I was in my ACAD phase, I was so focused on reaching the 10K cards number. I just neglected. I didn't neglect immersion, but I was so focused on the 10K cards number that I kind of overemphasized the SRS, right? And so I spent way too much time on the SRS. So thank God, gotta give a shout out to my boy Reynes with the Morphman fork. So, because for any beginners listening, basically like the current Morphman on Anki, the Anki add-on, it doesn't work by itself for Korean. So you can check out the fork on GitHub for the fork. And so because of that, I definitely spent a lot less time on Anki. And so I guess once I had Morphman, and then I deleted the pre-made Evita deck because it was just getting too bad. I deleted the grammar deck because it was useless, and so I just did pure sentence mining with Anki. And so I think after I deleted the decks, I worked on the intervals with help from Retro's Anki settings. So I tweaked it a bit, but then in general it was based on his Anki settings. And then in terms of the SRS, I'm where I am now, right? Right. Then next is the grammar. So as I mentioned earlier, I did make grammar cards, so I would read through the Talk to Me in Korean PDFs, but I would mine every sentence, right? So, because initially my mindset was, because I didn't believe yet in the immersion method, right? So I still thought that I had to kind of study the grammar. I didn't believe that I would pick it up through immersion. So I thought I'll forget, right? So I think many beginners believe this too, but I was like, I'll forget the grammar if I don't remind myself. So I made a lot of cards to study the grammar. But the problem with that is that you can't really make grammar cards for Korean, in my opinion, because the use cases for each one and the sort of edge cases for each grammar point in general is going to be so much that there's no point mining the grammar points. No point making Anki cards out of the grammar points, because you'll find a different use case which maybe be completely different, but then because you're so used to the cards that you mined, you'll just it just kind of clashes, right? So it's just much more simpler to just do reading the grammar and then learning from immersion, right? And so once I saw that the grammar deck was useless, I deleted it. And so my grammar study is where it is right now, which is basically just reading the grammar points and searching everything that comes up during immersion. So then let's talk about my active immersion. So at this time period, so in the beginning, because I heard that immersion was basically just watching stuff without subs, right? So I still haven't developed the philosophy of compelling comprehensible input yet, right? So that was I didn't really do much research back then. So I watched anything. So I watched boring dramas, like Misang, Itaewon Class. I watched that sort of stuff, but because I wasn't interested in it, it was very tedious to watch. So and I think a lot of beginners, even though you don't understand much of the language, stuff can still be interesting, right? I mean, like Running Man is fun. It's a fun show even if you don't understand anything. But the thing is, I watched a lot of stuff which was just boring. And so, but then once I learned more about the compelling comprehensible input, I read a lot of Krashen stuff. I realized that I should actually try to seek out stuff that I'm interested in. So this is why now my method involves a lot of watching stuff that I enjoy, which is personally it's the K-pop content. But then also it involves a lot of finding stuff to watch and then eliminating stuff I don't like. So I think once I developed the idea of eliminating stuff that I'm not interested about or not interested in, I moved on. So that's where I transitioned from a beginner to an intermediate for my active immersion. Then passive immersion. So if you guys have read the HED website, the dude Katsumoto puts a lot of emphasis on passive listening. to almost it's a cult. It's almost cult like behavior. The way they talk about passive listening, because they talk about, oh, first thing in the morning you wanna you wanna have the language in your ears, even when you're showering, when you're eating, even when you're sleeping. So because I was kind of brainwashed back then, I thought, oh, if I can get it in a year, right? So I did a lot of passive. So I was literally first thing in the morning, even when I was brushing my teeth, I had my earbuds in and I was just listening to random stuff. Even during because I had online class, right? So I was taking the classes online, but I had stuff going on in the background. Even when I was studying, I had stuff going on in the background. And then even when I was asleep, I actually had an audiobook playing in the background. So I mean, obviously, if anyone has actually tried it, it's a stupid idea because you can't sleep, and I couldn't focus on anything, because I was still fresh off the boat. So I was so focused on, I was just so gung ho about the whole ACAT thing, right? So I just drove myself crazy with the passive listening, and so I realized that passive listening wasn't, it's not something that you have to do, and so I cut out a lot of it. So now the only time I do passive listening is when I'm actually when I'm free, basically. So when I'm cooking or cleaning, or just doing like manual labor at work, then that'll be what I'll do for passive. And so I think that's a key change in my mindset. So my attitude towards passive listening definitely reflected how much I changed from a beginner to an intermediate, because in the beginner stage I was so focused on what other people were doing that I completely neglected my own personal needs and my own personal direction. And so once I figured out that I didn't actually need so much passive listening to make considerable gains, I just completely cut out most of it. So I think that's when I found okay, I'm in a more intermediate stage, right? Then lastly, reading. So I think I alluded to this in my earlier videos, but I didn't read in the beginning. That's true. I think for about the first 6 weeks, I didn't read at all. So it was all just watching stuff and religious sentence mining. Like some people say, some people pray to Jesus every day. I was sentence mining every day, right? And I was going at it like crazy, like I was a crackhead. So I found the current, I mean, it used to be called the MIA Korean Discord. Now it's the LTI Discord. But then there was also a lot of talk about the Yonsei readers, right? So I had to give it a go. So I that was my first reading content was the Yonsei readers. But because I didn't see the value of reading in the beginning, so I just and I didn't know how to properly use a graded reader. So I even picked up some native content books, because there's some PDF drives out there. So I read 1 or 2 native books, but the thing was, at a beginner stage, the native content was just too hard. So I wasn't reading, I was looking stuff up. And so I kind of breezed through the Yonsei readers. I think 1 to 3 wasn't too bad. 4 was a bit challenging. Like end of 3 to 4 was a bit challenging, but compared to native content, it's okay. It's not that bad. So I didn't really read a lot of native content until I finished 4. But I think once I finished 4, I was probably closer to an intermediate stage. And so because I kind of didn't really like reading, because everyone knows the Yonsei readers aren't the most interesting content. So I read a lot of webtoons at that time. I mean, I think webtoons are great for beginners because I think there's actually something that some good quality Korean content. There's a lot of good webtoons out there, and it's simple, but the thing is, there's kind of this middle point where most of it is filler words and filler content. There's a lot of art. So I mean, if you appreciate the art form, then good for you. But then, from a pure language acquisition perspective, I think it's good for beginners. But then there comes a point where the sort of language density is just too low. And so, but I was still in beginner phase, so I didn't really mind from the webtoons because I didn't know about OCR at that point. So it was just kind of just reading for fun. I mean, it was okay, but then I didn't. I also had to look up a lot of words, so it wasn't that fun anyways. So I think when the exact point where I transitioned, not exact, but the point where I felt I was no longer a beginner and I was an intermediate is when I found my first fun web novel. So I'd been looking around for web novels, but it was all either just too difficult or boring. So I found this one web novel. I forgot what it's called. I read it and I actually enjoyed it. For the first time, I was reading native content without having to look a lot of stuff up and actually enjoying the content. And that's when I knew I had left the beginner stage and I was an intermediate. So yeah, that about sums up my what I did as a immersion beginner. But I think the main takeaway from this video is that for any beginners out there, you just need to be patient, and you have to realize that everyone's journey for immersion is completely different. So, for example, what I say here, and maybe what Cloudy talks about in his earlier immersion update videos can be completely different. And so my main takeaway is beginners should just focus on finding what they like to do and finding their own direction. Because once you have a clear focus and a clear path, it's all smooth sailing from there. Because then you'll know exactly what you need to do to make the gains you need to make. And kids, like, share, subscribe. Your boy's got to get to 1 million subs soon. And remember to keep